on a reasonably stocked farm, you're going to need at least half of your silage. It's going to need to be high quality 72, 74 DMD plus silage. Your best chance of getting that high quality silage is from your first cut.
This week I'm joined by Mark Treacy, dairy specialist in Clonakilty, to chat about current management. With weather continuing to challenge people's patience, Mark will give some timely tips as we move through the month of April. I started by asking Mark about the varying grass scenarios that are on farm at the moment. We're into the second week of April nearly, and it's not going to plan, I suppose. So what's the recommendations? I suppose there's a couple of scenarios out there, Mark. There's people that have galloped ahead, maybe in spite of what we might have been suggesting, that people would try to keep a rein on getting through ground in the short term. Last time around, people are gone ahead, maybe gone into the second round. Then there's some people that have a little bit of first round left and kind of are actually in a good place because they still have enough grass because of that, basically. And then there are people obviously on heavy ground that haven't a lot of grazing done and they're getting going, but obviously hampered by the conditions over the last week as well, which haven't been hectic. So a mixed bag, I suppose, in terms of the grazing. So I suppose we'll start with the group that are kind of on track, the middle group. So they still have a bit of ground to graze. They're pretty well set up, Mark, are they?
So there's about 40% of the farms, Stuart, falling into that category that are broadly on target. And a lot of them now are just nearing the end of the first round or maybe in the early days of the second round. So I think just the main thing that they need to be looking at the moment is where is their average farm cover? You need somewhere in the region of 200 per cow um, on the farm. And also then what sort of covers are on those first paddocks they're going to graze in the second round. So like realistically, we need at least 1100, ideally a bit more than that on those first paddocks for the second round. And those are probably your two big markers to decide are you fit to go or not. Um, I suppose the big thing is fertilizer must be up to date. A lot of farms are still playing catch up there, so important if fertilizer isn't up to date, get it up to date now, and then I think we're really switching to starting to follow the cows from now on. That's the main thing really with those two groups. The other thing I suppose I would say on them is as we move into the second round, farmers are starting to close up ground for silage, and just be careful about how high you push the stocking rate on the main grazing platform. There has been some, I suppose we'll call it mediocre quality grazing done on a lot of farms because of the conditions that were out there. And perhaps this is the year to just leave that stocking rate a small bit lower on the grazing platform to allow more opportunities to take out paddocks for bales as the season progresses and correct quality issues in that way.
I suppose, is there good justification, Mark, then for maybe splitting silage fertilizer? I know it's getting late, as you said there, like, but rather than closing the door on yourself and covering it, if it is available to get the cows to, obviously that is ground that's away from home. It obviously makes sense, and we'll talk about it in a minute, to close that up. But the ground that's potentially grazable, like, should you hedge your bets there a little bit in the short term, because it just aren't that kind of the mid-April growth rates just yet, like.
Yeah, so growth rates are kind of normal. They're sitting in somewhere around 40 kilos at the moment. But certainly if you're closing up ground that is grazable by cows, I don't see anything wrong in splitting it. The only real negative is that you have to go in a second time, but at least it gives you the flexibility that if we get a 4 weeks growth and you're that little bit tight in grass, you have the option in going in and grazing a small bit of that silage ground. So to me, it is a sensible enough approach to go with, Stuart.
Okay, so then I suppose if we go to the farms that have had, I suppose in a normal year would have actually been after doing a very good job maybe in terms of getting their first round grazed by in or around the 10th, and started into the second round. And obviously there are farms that are ahead of that as well, which is kind of contrary to what we've been recommending with the last while. We would be of the opinion that people need to be thinking a little bit later into April rather than earlier, compared to maybe in the past when we had higher nitrogen applications available to us and maybe we're spreading a little bit more overall as a whole anyway as well. But for the people that are gone ahead of the schedule, we'll say, so maybe gone into those 1100s that you described there for the start of the second round, and maybe wondering, are we going to be able to keep the 1100 in front of them? What are the recommendations for them?
So there's about a quarter of the farms are falling into that category of being below maybe 650 of a farm cover. So really, these farmers need to start looking closely at growth and demand on the farm. Um, I suppose interesting when you look at the pasture-based figures, the growth rates on these farms is lower than um, the on-target farms, and demand is running slightly above growth. So while they're behind, they're actually where they should be, they're actually still falling further behind. So adjustments need to be made. In a lot of cases, I think it's a case of just slowing down the cows for a week. In a lot of farms will see them through. That may be a case of putting a small bit of silage into the diet. More extreme cases, it could be house the herd at night. It can be very tricky to allocate small amounts of grass to a herd and still graze night and day. And sometimes it's easier just to give them one decent grazing and then put them in at night. Um, I suppose an issue on a lot of farms in these scenarios is while there's sufficient feed barrier space for, say, a dry cow scenario, when we're in a milking cow scenario and we need the extra feed space, it's just not there. And in some of those situations, maybe options like housing part of the herd or even half the herd in by day and half the herd in by night could also be looked at as ways of just getting over those feed space issues. But really, it's just put some extra feed in just to reduce your demand. Like if you were to reduce your demand by enough that you would have, say, 15 kilos of growth ahead of demand, over the course of a week, you'll add 100 to your farm cover.
Yeah, so that would actually bring most of those farms in that 25% that you're talking to back up to target effectively, Mark, wouldn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
and it's that theory of grass grows grass. So by having a cover on the farm and that 200 per cow in April is kind of coming out to be the new number. We were probably being a bit more adventurous in the past, but that 200 a cow, so 600 plus of an average farm cover is deemed to be the number that's needed for to keep grass growing. So the big thing there is probably that people don't, as you said, keep running down the cover, which will actually slow down growth very significantly and make the return slower as well, obviously, as in getting back up out of that dip is going to be more difficult the deeper we go into it.
Exactly. Yeah. The deeper you dig the hole, the harder it's going to be to come out of it. So I think act early. But in reality, Stuart, 1 week will fix an awful lot of these farms if they're proactive about it.
Okay, so I suppose switching then to the other, and we were talking about it already, but as a friend of mine said once before, it's all about silage. If you're not making it, you're eating it. So about getting ready to make silage, Mark, I suppose we're not far away from. We're talking about early cutting dates in order to get quality. We're not long away now, maybe only 4 or 5 weeks away from main cut silage starting. There'll probably be bits of ground baled even in the meantime. If the weather picks up, because of that other third of farms will say that have ground to graze will actually need to bale some ground because they won't be able to graze all their first rotation. So main crop silage, what's the recommendation or what's happening out there in terms of fertilizer, and when is the cutting date being adjusted or what's happening?
So from what we're seeing on the ground at the moment, an awful lot of farmers are only just getting fertilizer out on the silage ground in the last week or so. Um, I suppose there's two kind of options there in the farmer's head. Do they go with normal fertilizer and push the cutting date out, or do they leave the cutting date where it normally would be and reduce fertilizer? I think it's that latter option is the correct one to go with. Um, like we know that our target cutting date is that early mid-May to get quality, and an awful lot of that is just tied back to when the grass plant wants to throw a seed head. Like on a reasonably stocked farm, you're going to need at least half of your silage. It's going to need to be high quality 72, 74 DMD plus silage. your best chance of getting that high quality silage is from your first cut. So I think we need to focus um, on trying to get it in that point. We can then look at ways of maybe getting a bit more bulk out of second cut afterwards. So realistically, we're only a month away from cutting silage on a lot of farms, Stuart. So where fertilizer isn't out, I'd be saying somewhere around 60 units of nitrogen. The reality is covers are gone too high on most of that silage ground for slurry to be going out. So at this stage, I'd be saying 60 units of nitrogen and get the slurry out afterwards, after it's cut. I suppose the big negative to delaying cutting date and trying to get bulk into your first cut now is that really all you're doing is pinching out the second cut. And we've seen that from research that by delaying your first cut date, yes, you get a bigger cut of material, but you end up with less in your second cut, and overall there's very little gain. And actually, when you look at it from an energy point of view, you actually go backwards by doing it. So your best bang for your buck is take a moderate first cut and then close it up again for your second cut.
And that's a pertinent point that you make, Mark, given the context of the last week, we'll say, in terms of the fuel blockade and so forth, and people getting very excited about the price of fuel, and justifiably so, to be fair, because it is high, and it is going to be a big problem for contractors in terms of what do they charge for their cuts. And the theory might be like, oh sure, we'll get good value out of the harvester while it is in the yard, and we'll make sure that there's plenty going through it. But it is very important that people realise first and second cut will balance one another out in general. And the other thing is, it's very important to get May growth into that second cut, really, isn't it?
Exactly. That's where you get a lot of your bulk for your second cut, is by having some bit of it growing in May. And I suppose like the final thing I like, Stuart, is when we're dealing with diets in the winter, it's relatively easy to dilute high quality silage down if it's a bit too powerful, we'll say, for the dry cow. It's very, very difficult to improve poor quality silage up to where it needs to be for a milking cow. So we've way more options to work with when we have high quality silage in the pit to start with.
Yeah, and then the other side of it as well, Mark, the fact that the slurry can't go on as well, you're kind of under fertilising in a way, really, aren't you? So, like, you're not actually going to have the power in that first cut. So, if you're just waiting then to cut, look, you could go on with the heavier nitrogen, as I said, but you're waiting to cut then, but it actually kind of won't mature as quick as you'd expect it to then either. So it's kind of a double whammy in a way. So it is the best option to go strike early and get significant May growth into the second cut, and hopefully get a good cut off the second cut. Well, you will. Like, the research shows that you'll get the same amount out of it. You just do it a different way this year, like.
Yeah. I suppose the other scenario you mentioned, Stuart, just a while ago, was the farms that actually have quite a lot of grass on them at the moment. In a lot of cases, that's just because of the conditions they haven't been able to graze. A proportion of those platforms are going to be cut for silage as well. And I suppose farmers would want to be cautious about closing too much of that ground up for actual first cut. And I'd be more encouraging them to take bales, probably in staggered cuts, to help create a wedge on that farm going forward. And that should be fairly decent quality feed as well.
Yeah, which will in those scenarios be needed anyway in the shoulders or potentially at other stages of the year. Like, and like, your point about the quality silage is very well made. Like, I mean, it's kind of deemed that we don't need good silage because we're a spring calving scenario, but sure, we're feeding silage for 3 months of the year at the start of the year and 3 months of the year at the end of the year, like, effectively. So, like, people need quality silage in the form of bales and in the form of pits, I would say as well. I'd agree with you 100% on that. And that the big driver of that is cutting date.
Totally. It's all to do with heading date. Yeah, it's all to do with heading date.
So I suppose the last thing then, Mark, will say in terms of the three things that people need to have in their minds at the moment is the breeding side of things. So I'm pretty sure that there's people down around you there now in South Cork that are already started AI potentially, but the vast majority of people will probably have the 25th or the 27th is a Monday this year, so the 27th I would anticipate will probably be the big kick-off date down here. It'll be a little bit later for people up the country as we move further north. But I suppose two questions that I'd throw to you then from that point of view. So The early calvers will say, is there like it's possibly too late for some of them, but should some of them be considering delaying a little bit? And then what actions should people be doing before we start the breeding season?
Yeah, so I suppose there's always a temptation when you see cows starting to bull to start the AI maybe a few days early, whatever. But as we've become better at getting cows compactly calving through better management, I suppose, number one, but also through the improved fertility genetics of the herd, effectively we've been pulling our mean calving date back. So while we might be starting on a similar date to when we always started, because the cows are now calving more compactly, we're actually pulling our mean calving date back. And that is having a big impact on farms in terms of grass demand in spring. So where farms are consistently struggling for grass in spring, it does make a lot of sense to push out the calving date a small bit. Um, and when they've done research on that in the past, in the likes of curtains, they found that pushing the calving date out didn't really have a huge effect on days in milk, and it didn't have a big effect on actual overall milk production per cow. But it did have significant influence on, I suppose, the feed budget for the cow, and it allowed more grass into the cow's diet. So certainly, it needs to be looked at on farm.
Okay, and then I suppose the actions then for the people, as I said, the majority will be in around there, the 25th or the 27th of April, probably 1st of May. So we have a couple of weeks to get our ducks in a row effectively. So from an animal management point of view, what are the key things the farmers need to be doing over the next couple of weeks ahead of that?
So I think the big thing there is having some kind of an idea of what cows are or aren't cycling within the herd. And like we know, once a cow is calved, say your kind of your strong month, 42 days, that kind of scenario, really we should be starting to see them cycling at that point. Um, so like different farms will have different options there. I'm not a fan of the full pre-breeding belt and braces kind of approach. I think it can nearly tire out a farmer too much. But certainly coming in with something like tail painting the herd even once a week and just observing what cows are or aren't cycling, I think has huge merit. An awful lot of farms now at this stage have different apps and collars and boluses and ear tags, all these sort of technologies. They're providing huge data as well. And it's worth going back and just having a look through it to see, are there cows that you would expect should be cycling at this stage that aren't cycling? And if they're not cycling, it's worth getting the vet out and getting a pre-breeding check done on them to see, well, what is the issue? Because the fear, Stuart, is a lot of these cows, while it might be quite easy to fix the issue, they're not going to fix themselves. And if we're not looking at them until the third week of the breeding season, by the time they've gone through whatever protocol is needed to fix the issues, they're getting into the middle of the breeding season, and they've less opportunities then to go back and calf before they kind of fall out the back end of the breeding season. So I think early intervention is vital.
Yeah, so like I suppose the big thing is I think it'll if people want to look up the video there that I did with David Helly there for Breeding Week a couple of weeks ago. He used a great phrase in it, like we don't time is something that we just don't have, and we're trying to buy back the time by making sure that those cows are actually functioning. And like the more heats, as Stephen Butler will say it, the more heats a cow has, the more fertile they become. So like the first heat that the cow has is probably isn't going to be 100% well, nothing's 100%, I suppose, but it just isn't going to be as fertile as maybe the third or fourth heat. And while you could get a cow in calf, obviously, to a first serve after a treatment in order to correct an issue with them, the chances of it are lower. But we've kick-started. It's like jump starting the tractor. Basically, we've got it running, and the battery's charging up again. So it'll be able to start the next time. So it's that's why we're advocating that early intervention, isn't it, Mark?
Totally. Yeah. The sooner you can get the process started, the more, I suppose, chances that cow has of being AI'd during the breeding season, and increases your chances of retaining that cow. And like it is really as simple as just tail painting the herd and seeing which ones are are losing the paint and which ones are still have paint on them coming up to the breeding season, or look up your apps.
Yeah, so it's not a big thing to, like, we're not advocating writing everything down, and it's just literally identify those that aren't active. And yeah, as you said, like, there's huge uptake of the technology in the last few years, but sure, it's no good if people don't act on it either. Like, if that list is on the phone and it doesn't ever make it into the yard in terms of the vet examining a number of cows, it's pointless investing in the technology, almost, you could argue.
Yeah, it's a huge resource on farm, and it's something that I suppose it's there at no cost. You've already paid for the app, so it's no additional cost to have the information there now. So if you have it, why not use it?
Very good, Mark. So sure, we'll be catching up again in a month's time for kind of another update in the month of May. But in the meantime, so people just have to keep an eye on the grass, get the fertiliser out for the silage, and get those problem cows looked after before the breeding season, and everything else that goes along with it, isn't it?
Very good, Stuart. Yep, thanks.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Mark Treacy for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.